Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Lacey. I'm the director of the Dole Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to the start of a very exciting program. Several months ago, and Jim Wilbanks and I were talking about this a few minutes ago, but several months ago, Ted Wilson, who many of you may know is a history professor here at KU, brought Jim in, and they proposed a very interesting idea to the Dole Institute, that is doing a series on military history. And it was something that was so exciting and so interesting, and it was something that just kind of really fits exactly into the mission of the Dole Institute. So we're very, very excited to be doing this. And this program will go on, if I remember correctly, for 10 months. It'll be the third Thursday of every month at 3 p.m. So you'll know every month at this time that there will be a lecture over here on the Cold War. And it's very exciting to us at the Dole Institute. It just gives us an opportunity to offer more programming to people from the community and our students here on campus. So we thank all of you for coming out. It's my pleasure to introduce the head of military history at Fort Leavenworth, who brought this wonderful idea to us. And we'll talk a little bit about the series, and we'll introduce our guest speaker today, Jim Wilbanks. Jim?
Thank you, Bill. I'll be mercifully brief, but first of all, I'd like to thank Bill and the folks here at the Institute for giving us the opportunity to put this series together and to be with you for the next 10 months. First of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of idea who we are. We are the Department of Military History at the Army Command and General Staff College. We have 42 in our department, 40 military historians of various areas of expertise. And we're responsible for teaching about 1,400 majors a year military history as part of the overall curriculum. We're one of 5 teaching departments. This program came about because I got my PhD here, started it while I was still on active duty as an Army officer. And Ted Wilson, previously mentioned, was my primary advisor. And we discussed the opportunity that the Dole Institute perhaps might present us to bring some of the expertise over here and talk about a topic near and dear to our hearts. Among the 40 military historians we have, they deal in all kinds of different fields, but we have a number of folks who deal with the Cold War period and various aspects thereof. So the idea was to bring this expertise over here in this really nice venue and talk about those areas in which we've done research. So the program is set, we'll begin today with the onslaught of the Cold War, and then we will finish in November with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And we'll look at the Cold War and the evolution thereof, and specifically some of the times when the Cold War has gone hot, and as we do that, we'll also look at the evolution of military policy during these years. So 10 lectures, third Thursday of every month, running from this month, February, till November. Our lecture today will be by Professor Sean Kalic. Sean is obviously a professor in our department. He has a BA from the University of Denver and a PhD from Kansas State, but we'll try not to hold that against him.
Try not to break anything today either.
He is a published author, and his new book is coming out from A&M Press, a place that's near and dear to my heart, Texas A&M, on the militarization of space from 1945 to 1967. So without further ado, Sean, the podium is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But yeah, please don't hold Kansas State against me, but it's just down the road a bit and a much nicer university. I have to say that, right? I want to thank Bill Lacey, Jim Wilbanks, Ted Wilson, and then also Janet Valentine, who's going to be speaking next week, who helped put the program together and schedule a whole bunch of things. So thanks to everybody. What I want to do today is talk about how the Cold War gets up and going, and we'll start with kind of 1945 and move through 1950. And as Janet's going to be talking about Korea next week or next month, I don't want to go too much into Korea. So the idea is to kind of stop us right as we get into Korea. So the idea for today is to talk about how Truman views the Cold War, what policies evolve, what the Soviet Union's doing as well, and then how we end up in this thing called the Cold War, which really starts off as a hot war in 1950 with Korea, okay? If you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them. I don't lecture that much at the Command General Staff College. It's more of an interactive discussion, so if you have questions, I much prefer that than me prattling on for an hour or so, okay? Okay, so I'm going to start in 1945, and I'm going to use the slides, which for some reason you can't see now. Oh, well. Now I can't see them either. You just went to sleep? Okay. This is why historians hate technology, by the way. So we're going to start in 1945, and what I want to do is talk about the significant events that happened in 45 that lead Truman to start thinking about what's going on in the post-World War II environment. So if we go down the list, start with the Yalta Conference, which is that first picture up there with FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, where they start talking about how the war is going to end and who gets what in Europe. And if you remember correctly, Roosevelt is the guy who actually recognizes the Soviet Union in 1933. There's a big debate in the State Department from 1917 on about should we recognize this nation that's just gone through this communist revolution. And a large contingency of State Department folks are saying no because the ideology is completely the antithesis of what the United States believes in. FDR, when he's elected, though, believes that he can work with the Soviet Union and bring them into the greater sphere of influence in the world community. And what happens is that he starts building a relationship with Joseph Stalin, and which is the ultimate climax really here is in 45 at Yalta, where he allows Stalin to have essentially a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe because the Soviet Union has fought relatively hard in the Second World War, has lost on the order of magnitude about 29 million folks, and believes they deserve at least a buffer zone. So this starts the Cold War tension that, because this deal between Stalin and Roosevelt isn't Churchill isn't necessarily pleased with that because he's a rabid anti-communist and he doesn't want to see half of Europe go to the way of Reds. Okay, so you have this tension at the very beginning. Now the problem here is that FDR is going to die. And Truman's going to assume the presidency. And we'll go through, Germany's going to surrender, and then we end up with the Potsdam Conference, which Truman goes to the Potsdam Conference thinking that he can't trust the Soviet Union. In fact, he goes to the Potsdam Conference thinking that he's not real happy with the fact that FDR is going to allow the Soviet Union to have this sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And he goes to this conference with essentially what's been called the atomic bomb in his pocket. We've just tested the first atomic bomb in July, and he's going to maybe use it as leverage if he can over Stalin's head because Stalin may not know that we have this yet. Unfortunately, Stalin already knows we have it because they have a fantastic espionage system, so it's not so much of a surprise. And this is really, I would argue, the first major confrontation of what we're going to come to call the Cold War, because what happens is that Stalin believes that he has a legitimate right to claim a sphere of influence, as agreed at by Yalta with FDR. But when Truman comes into power and they meet at Potsdam, he's going to take a much harder line and says and essentially argues that you have to have open and free elections, which is fine. But if you're Stalin, do you really want to allow open and free elections in Central Europe? No, you want a buffer zone. You're tired of seeing people march through and take large swaths of your territory, okay? So what happens at Potsdam is that you get the diplomatic tension between these two spheres of influence happening. And what's happening really is you have the ideology of the Soviet Union who wants this sphere of influence. You have the American and British point of view that's saying, hey, we just fought a war against dictators. We don't want another dictator showing up. So what we need is open and free elections. So from the very get-go, you have this tension in the political system, a free and democratic system versus an authoritarian communist/socialist system. Okay? Now the next big event, August 6th and August 9th, are the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are going to essentially end the war in the Pacific. Now you may have heard the debate on the dropping of the bomb, that Truman does this to scare the Soviet Union, put them in their place. It's actually much more simple than that. He does it to end the war quickly and save American lives. Point blank, okay? Been to the Truman Library, seen the documents, no discussion. If you read Garo Porvowitz, who starts this historical train, not a bad book, but really sloppy history work, okay? So what happens essentially is that we have the political tension at Potsdam. We drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, the Soviet Union is going to agree to come into the war at the very last minute and gobble up large, copious amounts of islands that they lost in the Russo-Japanese War early in the century, which is fine. Great, but does that really help us with this discussion of we already have this tension in Western Europe with the Soviet Union encroaching, and now we're going to have elements of the Soviet Union encroaching in the Pacific as well. So again, you're starting with this political tension between two systems. The Soviet Union is trying to expand as much as they can, and for good reason, because they want huge buffer zones between capitalist countries. And this is where you kind of have to go into some of the Marxist thought, the idea that if you're a good, strong Marxist, who's your vital enemy? Who's at the root of all problems in the world? Capitalists, right? And who are the capitalists? Us, right? The Japanese, right? Everyone that's not Soviet or in this sphere of influence. So again, what you have is this tension in both the Western European theater, and then now it's going to happen in the Pacific as well. Now, despite all this political tension, you also have the UN starting to form, which is supposed to be this community of nations that we're going to get together. And we tried this once before, called the League of Nations, which didn't work that well. But we've ironed out the bugs, and we want to get all the folks, all the nations in the world to get together and start talking about how we can make things peaceful. War may not have to happen if we can diplomatically rationalize our way out of it. So by October 1924, and this is just 45, things have really started to solidify politically and then economically as well, which we didn't talk about on the slide because there's not enough room. Because what's happening in Europe is as Germany surrenders, you have both mainly in France and Italy, you have a resurgence of indigenous communist parties starting to rise up and say, hey, we need to do something to get the people back to get working again. They need food. We've just gone through 4 years of war. We know things are devastated, but we need help. And what's happening is you have this backlash, indigenous backlash against democracy and capitalism. Now, the problem is in 45 that we see this through the lens of Potsdam and Yalta. So if you're Truman and you start to see these indigenous movements start springing up in France and Italy, what are you going to do about it?
Question. To what extent did William D. Leahy, the Chief of Staff to Truman and Roosevelt, play in influencing some of these decisions? I think that's his picture behind Roosevelt in the left.
That is, and
He's been the ambassador to Vichy France before
right.
it broke out. So as you talk about Truman, you need to talk about his advisors and his staff as well as his influence.
Well, true, but part of this project is really to talk about the big macro picture. And Leahy is a vital player. The problem is, in the flow and in the 40, 50 minutes I have, going into excruciating detail is just, we can talk afterwards. But Leahy is a profound player in this, and he has specific thoughts on France and what to do with the communists, which actually plays out that you have to send OSS teams in to essentially eradicate the communists, which we both do in France and in Italy, by the way. So, at the end of 45, what do we have going on in Western Europe? We've eradicated 2 indigenous communist regimes in France and Italy. We have a sphere of influence solidifying across Central Europe. In the Pacific, you have the Japanese under MacArthur. You also have the Soviet Union taking back large swaths of land from the Russo-Japanese War, and they're also playing around in Manchuria. So, things have solidified significantly. Okay? Questions on 45? 46 is a much different year in the fact that now that we have a political situation stabilizing, what we're going to start to recognize is, as we're demobilizing from World War II, Truman's in a bit of a conundrum. He recognizes the Soviet Union is becoming at least a peer competitor, but he doesn't want to start another war. We have to go through rapid demobilization, and he wants to get the economy back on a nice civilian ground, because after all, what happens to your economy when it's been on a wartime footing for 4 years? You're not producing lots of cars or shovels or things like that, right? So he wants to reorient the economy, but the problem is, in Europe specifically, the Soviet Union has about a 3-to-1 force ratio, an advantage over the Western Allies, so it becomes a problem. And what happens, the first picture there is George F. Kennan, who's an old Soviet hand. He's been around Moscow, he spends the war in Germany, and spends lots of time thinking about the Soviet Union. And he's going to write this long telegram. Now, the long telegram, for those of you that remember telegrams, is 8,000 words, which is why it's called a long telegram. For those of you that don't remember telegrams, this is like probably an 8-page tweet, okay? Good reference? All right? It's really long. And what he does in this long telegram is he lays out essentially the ideology of the Soviet Union, and he makes a point that they are inherently expansionistic, that they need to be checked. Now, check doesn't mean military check. It means essentially using economic resources, diplomatic resources, military resources to help kind of contain the Soviet Union. And this starts to become a policy paper in the State Department, because Kennan's actually going to start working with the policy planning staff inside the State Department and start piecing together what's going to become a strategy for essentially the duration of the Cold War. And that's the significance of the long telegram.
Sir,
Yes,
for us kids,
sure.
who was Kennan? Was he Secretary of State?
No, he's a Foreign Service officer
Okay.
who his specialty is the Soviet Union. Okay? All right. And he spends the 20s and 30s in the Soviet Union and in Lithuania and Estonia. So he is essentially the recognized expert on the Soviet Union. Okay? Sure. March 5th, we have Harry Truman, who, no, well, actually Truman's there, but that's actually Churchill. Truman invites Churchill to come over to Missouri and give a little speech at Westminster University, and Churchill is going to announce that an Iron Curtain has descended upon Europe. And this is a significant speech because Churchill's out of power, by the way. He's no longer prime minister. But he's really not happy with the Soviet Union and the fact that they are gobbling up copious amounts of land in Central and Eastern Europe. And what he recognizes is that the free powers, the United States, France, Germany to some extent as well, and Britain need to band together and stop this spread of communism. And it dovetails very nicely with Kennan's idea. Kennan's going to make the policy argument that here's a nice logical explanation of what the Soviet Union is doing. Churchill is going to come out with essentially the heart on the sleeve, we must stop this because we're very good Democrats and capitalists. And if we let this system go, we too will become communists. So what you have is essentially, stay in. Yeah, I tend to pace, sorry. It's from working with majors who don't want to stay in one spot at one time. You know, we got target, okay? So what happens is that you have Kennan who's going to lay out the ideological pieces of what becomes a containment policy, while at the same time you have Churchill who's going to provide kind of the public face, that there's something else to be done. And after all, you have to love Winston Churchill, right? He's the guy that brought England to the war. So if he's saying this is something that has to be done, he's going to sell it to the American people. The problem is he doesn't convince one person. Anybody want to guess who that is? Don't be afraid, shout it out. Harry Truman, right? Truman doesn't quite know what he wants to do yet because of that conundrum that if you embrace this concept that Kennan's outlining, it's going to cost lots of money. In fact, you're going to have to rearm, you're going to have to rebuild the military, and you're going to have to invest heavily in conventional weapons, and probably atomic weapons too, because again, we're at a significant disadvantage in conventional weapons of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact forces. Now, to make matters worse, at the end of the year, in October 1928, the Greek Civil War is going to kick off, which is really against communists and the nationalist forces. And what's going to happen is that this is going to solidify, I would argue, Truman's support, because what he's seeing is yet once again one country maybe going red. And again, the whole context of this first period of the Cold War, which is really 45 to 50, is if you're watching the map, it seems like elements of Europe and even elements in the Pacific are going red virtually overnight. So you look at it one day, it looks nice and peaceful. The next day, oh no, Czechoslovakia is red, Hungary's red, Greece is now maybe going red. So if you're Truman, what option do you have by October of 1946? Do you have to embrace this new Cold War? But again, the conundrum's still there. Can you do it without investing large sums of money and switching back on the war economy? And he doesn't know yet. The United States is still rapidly demobilizing. We're going to keep enough troops in Europe to help at least settle the Four Powers Agreement and figure out what's going on in Europe. But again, the main threat has already emerged that what do we do with the Soviet Union? 1947. In many ways, you have the ideological construct going on in 46, and you have the emotional plea from Churchill in 47. I would argue you start to have the codification of policies coming out to start the Cold War and actually start developing policies, both diplomatic and military policies, to conduct the Cold War. The first one is the Truman Doctrine, which is a direct result of what's going on in the Greek Civil War. Truman's going to make the argument based upon reading the long telegram, based upon briefings, based upon discussions with Churchill, based upon looking at a map on the wall, that the United States will provide support to those folks who want to maintain democracy and capitalism. If there's a threat of communism, the United States will stand up and support you. Now, support, if you're in Greece, what does that mean to you? If I say, I'm going to support you. Money. Okay, money's good. What else do you need? Arms, troops. Well, I can't give you troops, though, because that looks a little too militaristic, and that may upset the Soviets, right? So what can I give you? Food. That'll work. Training. We can't do that, though, but we'll let the British do it. After all, we have allies, right? And again, what we can do is, we can become the major financer, and then you let the British do the dirty work, the training, the arms, the stuff like that. So this is what you start to see the emergence of the active advocation of a policy of stopping to hold the line against communism with the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is a significant element in the fact that it's going to argue that if you want to be free, we will stand by you and do whatever we can. Now, that whatever we can is more of a wink, wink, nod, nod, whatever we can. We can give you money, we can give you some arms, but we always can't be overtly supportive of you. And this is the kind of game that's going to go on for the next 40, 50 years. Okay? The next big thing is really in June 26, which is the Marshall Plan. That's George C. Marshall up there in the center. Now, Marshall's Secretary of State, and he comes up with this idea that, and it's largely based off what happens after the First World War. Anybody ever read John Maynard Keynes in here? Everybody ever heard John Maynard Keynes? Kind of an important economist, right? John Maynard Keynes is actually part of the British negotiation team during Treaty of Versailles during World War I. And he makes the argument that the Allies can't necessarily punish Germany economically with reparations because Britain's #1 trading partner prior to the war was Germany. They need them. And what happens is as he's making this argument is that he's quickly thrown off the staff because somebody has to pay at World War I. It's the Germans, right? The Austro-Hungarians are gone, so you have to make somebody pay. And he goes out and he writes this book called The Economic Consequences of Peace, which is this fantastic book that I'm sure your library has it. Check it out because he goes point by point. How do you make sure you rebuild after a war? It's not demanding reparations. It really is. The first thing you want to do is reinvest in the economy, get the economy back up and producing, people back to work, people buying things, people eating, people building, things like that. The Marshall Plan is essentially that same option for World War II. What we want to do in both the Pacific and in Europe is we want to reinvest in the nations. If there's a threat of communism there, what do communists like more than anything? Idle, hungry hands, right. And you have that potentially in Europe. You've seen it in France, you've seen it in Italy, and now there's a threat in Greece as well. So Marshall doesn't necessarily come up with a plan. In fact, he's not a big fan of calling it the Marshall Plan. That's Truman's idea. But the problem, or the plan comes up as what we need to do is invest copious amounts of money into the economies of Europe and the Pacific as well. And the plan isn't just for our allies, by the way. The plan's a wholesale plan. If you want money to reinvest in your infrastructure, in your industry, in your economy, let us know and we can help. So it goes to places like France, Germany, England, Italy. The Czech Republic's involved, or Czechoslovakia wants it too. Yugoslavia wants it as well. The problem is Stalin steps in and says, no. You're in my sphere of influence, and we can't have that insipid capitalism seeping its way into our sphere of influence. So he clamps down on both the Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia accepting Marshall Plan money. For Stalin, what's the Marshall Plan look like if you're Stalin? Bribery? Is it a threat to you? Yes, why?
Because people will want to go along with it.
Yeah, and you don't have the money to give. You can provide lots of armor and infantry elements to these countries, but you can't provide foodstuffs, you can't provide credits, you can't provide industry. So if you're Stalin, what you see in this Marshall Plan isn't an attempt to avert the next war, it's attempt to really codify those lines between East and West. And part of the Cold War, and as a Cold War historian, part of our job is to understand this Cold War not just from the U.S. perspective, because we all grew up, hey, we were right, the communists were wrong. But we have to understand, and at the end I have a few books that I'd recommend that get us into that mindset, or at least help us to understand the Soviet side. But for Stalin, this is a significant element. You can't compete with this. And if you've seen your country invaded, 2 times over the last 35 years, do you want to see it go a 3rd time? No. You're working hard to rebuild it after the war. The Soviet Union is completely devastated after the war, but they do have a strong military presence afterwards, okay? So what happens is that you have the Truman Doctrine, which is really the military side, saying that we're going to stand by you and support you if you want to be free and democratic. The Marshall Plan is the money side, and now we're going to give you copious amounts of money to support it as well. So again, if you're Stalin, you have a double whammy. You have the United States and its allies supporting you militarily, and now you have lots of money being supported as well.
Is there food involved too in the Marshall Plan?
I think actually there is some food involved. It's wheat and grains and things like that, right? Because again, 5 years in war in Europe, things are pretty decimated, okay? And again, this was offered to the Soviet sphere of influence. But Stalin says no. Czechoslovakia, you can't have the money. Yugoslavia is probably the one that comes closest to accepting it. And at the 11th hour, Stalin essentially says, if you do it, Tito, there's going to be hell to pay.
Was there any offer to the Soviet Union?
I'm not sure. In fact, the Soviet Union quickly comes up with their own plan called Kamkan, which it really is, we can give you industrial stuff to build weapons and food stuff, tractors, but it's really more suppressed than that. Sir?
I just finished John Gaddis's An American Life, the biography.
And on Kennan.
And he recounts that one of Kennan's coups when he was working on the policy planning staff was to advise Truman Marshall to offer the Marshall Plan to Stalin.
Right.
Because Kennan understood that Stalin would not accept it because it would be a huge loss.
It's a slap in the face, right? Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and we can talk about this at the end, that Kennan ends up getting a really bad kind of rap at the end of 50, and we'll talk about NSC 68 here in a little bit, but from my perspective, and I haven't read Gaddis yet, it's on the short list to read, he seems to have the best take on how to read the Soviet Union, specifically how to read Stalin, that there are inherent contradictions in the system, and that there are ways you can slowly erode it without confronting it necessarily strongly in a military perspective. And the Marshall Plan is one of his key elements that economically there's no match for the U.S. economy. So what you can do is really use this to your advantage against the Soviet and their sphere of influence. Now in July of 47, Kennan again is going to dovetail off of the long telegram, and he's going to write a little article called Sources of Soviet Conduct in Foreign Affairs magazine. And he signs it Mr. X, and you may have heard of it referred to as the famous Mr. X article. Everyone around D.C. that reads this knows who wrote it because they've read the long telegram. It's George F. Kennan. And what Kennan does in Sources of Soviet Conduct, he goes one step further than the long telegram. And he starts laying out not only the problems of the Soviet Union, like he did in the long telegram, but now he starts arguing that there's a new method to contain the Soviet Union, that we need to use our assets, economic assets, diplomatic assets, political assets, military assets, to essentially play zone defense on the Soviet Union. And in zone defense, it's a slow, methodical type of defense, right? It's a basketball town, right? K-State's not, so I'll give you that, all right? And what do you get out of a zone defense? No basketball fans in here? Nobody?
You're not going to get inside.
Right, you're not going to get it right. It's just, it's pressure, right? You let them make their own mistakes, and then you capitalize on it. And this feeds off of Kennan's idea the Soviet Union has inherent flaws in the system. All we need to do is keep the pressure on. At some point in the future, they'll collapse on their own. Now, great plan, but if you're Truman, what do you want to know? If you're the Joint Chiefs, what do you want to know? When? How long? Well, I don't know. If I'm Kennan, it's just going to happen. Trust me. I'm the expert here. But in the political sphere, you just can't, you need time. You need a date. And you just can't have that. I mean, if Kennan comes back and says, you know, Harry, it's going to take 50 years. Does Truman support it? I don't know. But he leaves it as that. But again, the significance of this article is that it really provides the impetus for what becomes a containment policy. And it goes one step further from the long telegram in advocating the containment policy as the policy that needs to be adopted by the United States for the duration of what becomes the Cold War. Pardon me? It was July 47. Oh, Foreign Affairs. Mhm. And it's just signed Mr. X. Now, the last element up there is the National Security Act of 47, which is going to essentially codify some of the lessons learned from the government during World War II. Essentially, the Air Force is going to be the first independent service to come out of this, as is the CIA, as is the National Security Council, and a few other elements. So what we're doing with this act is really building the military and political structure that we come to know during the Cold War. So you're going to have an independent Air Force now, you're going to have an independent CIA, which comes out of the old OSS, and you're going to have an operations branch, which was the old OSS, and now an intel analyst branch, which is going to kind of disseminate and read all the intelligence and do all that fun stuff. In addition to that, you're going to have a National Security Council emerge out of that too, which is going to be an executive level agency to help brief the president and handle national security concerns. Because the idea is that the president isn't necessarily an expert on these matters, so he needs to be briefed by the best and the brightest. So the National Security Council is going to become kind of the internal think tank within the executive branch to handle the defense issues, to handle security issues, and then brief the president on proper course of action. Okay? Questions on 47? Moving right along. Sir?
You mentioned Marshal Tito a few minutes ago, how he did not, the 12th hour, the 11th hour, he did not accept any of Marshall's plan. I understood that Yugoslavia was the only Eastern Bloc country at the time that was able to get through that crack. Because Tito and Stalin had kind of a rocky relationship. And Stalin, there came a time when Stalin gave Marshal Tito more of the upper hand than any other communist bloc leader. Am I mistaken?
Yugoslavia under Tito does not get Marshall Plan money. Tito was able to work out a deal with Stalin. And remember, Yugoslavia isn't necessarily, in fact, they are not part of the Warsaw Pact. They are essentially neutral, but they have essentially most favored nation status with the Soviet Union. And so they're allowed to kind of chart their own independent course, but they're kept on a leash by Stalin because essentially they control military elements and some financial and foodstuff elements of them too. Okay, good question though. So here we are in 48. We have the beginnings of what's going to become a containment policy. We have ideas to back it, and we have a national security strategy that is starting to evolve and emerge to support it. At the same time, though, we're going to have a few setbacks here. And the first two are big, major setbacks. In February of 48, the communists take over Hungary. Now, in your mind, how do the communists take over a country? Rig elections, okay? How else? Tanks. That's one of their favorite. You just roll tanks in and shoot people.
Well, in possession of 9 tenths of law, and when the war ended, there was almost 2 million Soviet veterans, Soviet Canadians,
Right.
So, I mean, they were there.
They own it, and they've paid for it too. I mean, 29 million people, of course, of the wars, you've earned it. You fought for it, okay? And what happens in Hungary is interesting in the fact that this doesn't happen in 45, it doesn't happen in 46, it happens in 48. Because it's a slow, methodical process, because Hungary is a violently independent democracy, or wannabe democracy, but it has elements of both fascism and communism there. What happens between 45 and 48 is that those forces have to be essentially suppressed and thinned out from the Soviet perspective. So it takes 3 years, essentially, for the Soviet Union to work with the indigenous Communist Party in Hungary to start essentially supporting land reform, land redistribution, and building up the Communist Party infrastructure, while at the same time suppressing the Catholic Church, which is a major element in Hungarian society as well. So when we see Hungary turn communist, which it does go through its first election in 48, and it's a legitimate election. It is rigged, by the way, in the fact that 3 of the 4 parties tend to be communist parties, and there's one small kind of Democratic party that has no chance to ever win the election. But from the outside, it looks like an independent and free election. Anybody want to guess who wins? The commies, because they have 3-1. So if you're Truman, you think you're making strides. What, is this a setback? Is this a blow to the system? Is this going to allow you to trust Stalin anymore? No, not at all. He's more dubious than ever now. You see how he manipulates people, manipulates cultures to support the system of communism. The same thing is going to happen actually in February 48 in Czechoslovakia. It's almost the exact same process. Czechoslovakia has the same, essentially same pangs for democracy as is the Hungarian people, but it's going to be suppressed. The only difference is the Soviet Union is much more brutal in Czechoslovakia because the Czechs want to kind of rise up and fight off the communists, so they have to actually roll in tanks and infantry and suppress guerrilla movements. Sir?
What countries did they actually allow Stalin to take out of his sphere of influence to begin with?
Well, the original discussion...
Hungary would be an ideal one, and so would Czechoslovakia.
Well, absolutely, but again, if the difference is back to that very first slide between Roosevelt and Truman. Roosevelt sees that, okay, to work with Stalin, to get him in the largest community of nations, maybe we need to acquiesce and give him some countries. And actually, Stalin says, don't worry, I'll have open and free elections. Maybe you trust him, you know, but we've seen this once before, by the way, when a dictator says, hey, all I want is a Sudetenland. I don't want anything else. And I promise. And then, you know, peace in our time, no problem. Well,
Which ones did he lock down with bother for elections, like Estonia, Latvia, and
yeah, Poland,
Slovenia,
yeah.
those places? They didn't
Right.
bother with elections.
Yeah, no, they're just quickly gobbled up. Poland's another one that's quickly gobbled up. And they allow elections in each one of them, but they're sham elections. The elections are slowly designed that the Communist Party is going to win. What's so significant about Hungary and Czechoslovakia is that from 45, 46, 47, it looks like there's a chance they can go democratic. So the Soviet Union is working very hard to make sure they don't go democratic. So that's the significance. And there's a large contingency of Czechs and Hungarians in the United States as well, and they're putting significant pressure that we need to do something about this.
Didn't they put a lot of, the Russians put a lot of their own people into the political scenes of all these countries, though, to run them?
A lot of their folks actually go to Russia in 45, 46. They come back in both Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and then they get trained and educated, and they go back and run the party infrastructure and police system and things like that. Absolutely, yes.
I'm not sure if it's an apocryphal story or not. I think in 44 or 45, when Churchill met Stalin, they had pulled out a napkin and listed the countries, what percentage were they going to get. And it seems to me some of this, divvying up the territory after World War II, had gone even earlier than
Yeah.
Churchill had already said, okay, look, you own this.
Yeah, and there are bigger disputes than what I have up here. I mean, Iran's a huge dispute. The Soviet Union's going to keep forces in Iran for quite some time. Korea's a dispute. So this is an ongoing tension. And again, part of the problem with only having an hour to talk is I can't talk about everything, unfortunately. Okay. So we have two nations that we thought maybe go our way, not go our way in 48. And again, this is a significant blow to our burgeoning democratic design in the West. The last issue in 48 really is a Berlin blockade. Remember, Berlin in Germany is under a four-party agreement. Berlin is divided into two sectors. You have the Soviet sector, and then you have the Allied sector. What's going to happen in 48 is that from 45 to 48, you're going through significant negotiations with the Soviet Union on what currency is going to be in Germany, how you're going to regulate and manage this, what becomes Germany later, and then ultimately how you're going to manage and regulate Berlin. And what's happening is because the Soviet economy is so wrecked, they want to have significant economic reform in Berlin and in Germany, and they want the ruble to be the standard currency, which, fine. But the problem is the ruble is worth absolutely nothing. So the United States steps in and says, no currency reform. In fact, if you want currency reform, we'll use dollars and/or we'll use Deutschmarks because they're actually worth something. So what happens in this economic negotiation is that Stalin in June of 48 is going to actually cut off rail access, road access, and actually river access to Berlin, to the Allied sector of Berlin, because what happens, you have to travel through Soviet-controlled territory to get to the U.S. sector of Berlin. So if you're Truman now, this is one of the first tense crises of the new Cold War. What do? How do you handle this? You cannot now travel to Berlin. You can't get foodstuffs in. You can't assist the people. And why is Stalin doing it? Well, no one really knows why he did it, by the way. But he seems to be doing it to essentially force the issue with economic reform. And there's another issue that spins out of that. Economic reform is the primary issue. The secondary issue is reunification. That what Stalin wants is a reunified Germany, and guess who wants to be in control of that reunified Germany? Not the U.S. Stalin and the Soviet Union, okay? So some historians make the argument that what he's trying to do is essentially force the issue to see if Truman's going to stand up and fight for Berlin and see what he's going to do. Because after all, who holds the conventional superiority in military forces here? Russia, okay? So what assets do we have that we can actually help the free people of Berlin while we're negotiating this standoff? Airplanes and food. And in fact, there's maybe a general you may have heard of called Curtis LeMay. Yeah, I know John's heard of Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay is managing essentially the Air Force in Europe at this time, and he's the guy who's going to help essentially put together the Berlin airlift, and then he's going to go on and do strategic aircraft and a whole bunch of other stuff. And what they're going to make the argument is the Air Force is going to say, hey, we can do this. We can supply them through air corridors. You just fly over Soviet territory and land at Tempelhof Airport, unload your stuff, and fly back out. Sounds easy, right? No problem. Well, what if the Soviets try to shoot us down? Well, let's hope they don't do that. And luckily, they don't do that, all right? There are a few crashes along the way, but it works out pretty well. But again, this is the first significant kind of military confrontation of the Cold War. In fact, Truman is going to call Stalin's bluff, and he's going to send a flight of B-29s. B-29 is the first airplane that dropped the atomic bomb, and they've modified them in the few years since the war, and they call them silver plate B-29s, and they're especially modified, and just by looking at them, you can kind of tell they're special, and they're used to drop atomic bombs. Truman's going to send a flight of these to England, and I would argue this is the first element of kind of nuclear deterrence. Now, there's some brinksmanship going on here, and the fact that the United States in this time has a handful of atomic weapons. They're scattered all over the country. They take anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months to assemble because they're under the control of the Atomic Energy Commission, not the military. And the military has to petition for these parts and put them together, and then you ship them over to England and all this stuff. Soviet Union doesn't necessarily know that, but what you have visually is a whole flight of B-29s flying to England to pre-stage in case things get ugly. So really, the first act of nuclear deterrence is going to happen here. Now, is West Berlin worth going to nuclear war? Who has nuclear superiority? Oh, United States. Soviet Union doesn't have a bomb yet. It's going to come in a year. But we think it's going to come in about 5 or 6 years, by the way. So what happens is that this is going to be resolved relatively peacefully. Now, we don't know if it was deterrence or if it was negotiations that were taking place behind the scenes on the economic issues and the reunification issues. In fact, reunification, we come down and say, no, it's not going to happen under a Soviet sphere. Economic issues, no, you're not going to get the ruble as the primary currency in Berlin. And one day, all of a sudden, it's lifted. But what causes it, I don't know. But this really is the first significant military confrontation where people are starting to kind of hold their breaths to think, okay, this is definitely a new era. We have atomic weapons now. They have lots of tanks and infantry. What's going to happen? Okay? (1949). We have NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is going to be that collective security element of the West to stand up against the Soviet Union. And the idea is here that the United States and Britain can't necessarily provide all the forces it needs to hold the line in Western Europe. So what we do is we call on the community of nations to pony up forces and money to provide essentially a unified military force in Europe. The problem is when we stand up NATO, not everybody's on board. In fact, Truman's going to call Eisenhower, who's serving as president of Columbia University, and says, and essentially sends him to Europe to essentially negotiate the final phase of the political negotiations with NATO. And he gets the French on board and the Italians on board and a few others. The idea, though, is that because the major NATO, European NATO powers have yet to recover from the war, can they necessarily afford to, give 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 divisions of military to NATO? No, they can't. So what happens in this immediate interim is that we have the political structure forming, we have the military structure forming, which is going to be largely supported by the United States, Britain to a lesser extent, and then some French and some German elements, even though the French don't want the Germans rearmed. This is going to lead to German rearmament because we need them on the front lines. But the problem is that the European NATO countries don't have the money, nor do they have the assets to meet the force goals that we think we need to hold the line against the Soviet Union. So if we don't have the force goals, what's one of the ways we can leverage our technology to enhance our force structure? How can we get more bang for the buck, to put it a different way? Air Force, yes, getting closer. What does the Air Force drop? What do they drop? Atomic bombs, right? Atomic bombs are a great force multiplier, right? If you don't have conventional advantage, what you can do is now start relying on atomic weapons. And this is the significance of NATO, is that we don't have the force structure conventionally to support a land war in Europe, but we have atomic weapons that can balance that force structure. So what we see happening because of the Berlin blockade and then ultimately NATO forming is a greater reliance on the United States and its allies on atomic weapons as a force equalizer, if not multiplier. Okay? So now we have the military side starting to take hold in the Cold War as well. Berlin blockade is going to end, as I talked about, relatively peacefully. To this day, I think every historian you talk to has a different opinion on why it ended, because all of a sudden someone just seems to say, okay, it's over. And the first crisis of the Cold War is gone. But I'll argue that the legacy of it is that it really does codify brinksmanship and the idea that if you saber rattle, maybe you can get your way. In the United States, for the United States side, it demonstrates that we're willing to stand up and have a strong resolve to maintain democracy and freedom. It's really the second event to secure the Truman Doctrine. Okay? Germany is going to emerge out of this as a new federal republic. And remember, you're going to have the Federal Republic of Germany, which is the good Germany. You're going to have the People's Democratic Republic, which is the Soviet Germany. Anytime you see People's Democratic Republic during the Cold War, it tends to be a communist nation. It's one other play on words, okay? And again, what's going to emerge out of this is, again, we realize that NATO doesn't have the force structure. So if you're France, you don't like Germany being rearmed, you don't like Germany reforming, but you're going to need them on the front line. And there's a tenuous negotiation that Eisenhower helps to negotiate between the French and the Germans, that, hey, we need them. You guys are brothers now fighting the communist aggression, and we can kind of forget the past. But if you're French, if you're German, you have a long history to kind of forget and to bury. And it's going to bubble up through the Cold War, but again, in the last 4 decades, you've had some tension between you guys over Alsace, Lorraine, and a few other issues. But the Cold War, they're going to try to at least focus their energy via NATO through the Soviet threat. The second to last point on there is August 1929. The Soviet Union is going to test its first atomic bomb, that's a picture of Joe 1 right there. And what's happening in the Truman administration this time is that we're deeply concerned that the Soviet Union is actually getting ahead of the United States in air power and advanced technology. And there's commissions set up within the Truman administration called the Air Policy Commission, or the Finletter Commission, which is Thomas K. Finletter is the chairman of the commission. And they're looking at Soviet aircraft production statistics versus what the United States is doing, and there's all kinds of debate on who's winning the air power race. And there's some suspect that the Soviet Union was going to outpace us by 1953, 1954. And Truman's concerned about this, and he's concerned about when the Soviet Union is going to get the bomb. And he pulls in essentially all intelligence assets that he has and experts. And they say, you know what, it took us 3.5 years to build the bomb. The Soviets are kind of backward. Yes, they have some Germans. But it's going to take them probably anywhere from 53 to 56 to get the bomb. And that's kind of a conservative estimate. It may take longer, it may take a year or two shorter. The problem is they're flying some reconnaissance missions on the Soviet Union and come back with radioactive material in August there and have to tell Truman, guess what, boss? They've already tested their first bomb. And it's a complete shock to everybody because no one expected this to happen for another at least 4 years, by the way. So remember how we talked about the Berlin blockade and using nuclear deterrence as a way to leverage our political policy? If the Soviet Union has a bomb now, can we do that still? Yeah, it levels the playing field significantly. So again, it's going to change the dynamic of the Cold War now if all of a sudden they have the weapon. And one of the problems here is that we don't have a lot of good intelligence on the Soviet Union. They're very good at getting into our system because we have an open, free society. We're very bad at getting into their system because it's a closed, totalitarian state, and it's hard to get people in and to get good information out. So the problem is by 49, we now have a nuclear standoff. We have capabilities on both sides. It's going to take a few years now for the Soviet Union to really build up its air power strength and then its atomic strength, but it's there, and now you have two sides with two atomic weapons. Now, the last major element here is the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong are going to finally win China. And this is a struggle that's been going on since at least 1920. It's suppressed a bit during World War II to throw out the Japanese. Then it gets hot again after the war's over, and by 49, Mao's going to win. Nationalists are going to get thrown off and go hang out in Taiwan for a few years. So in the course of, 4 years, from 45 to 49, if you're Truman and you're looking at the big map on the wall, what's gone red? Quite a bit. And now China's gone. And now the Soviet Union has the bomb. So things are getting pretty tense here by 1949. And this is a time when you don't want to reinvest in the military because you're trying to get the economy back on a nice civilian track. You want people to, benefit from the GI Bill, go in and rebuild America and their lives. But can you afford not to do anything here? You have to do something. You can't let these guys have the bomb. You can't let Reds encroach upon the world. It seems wherever you allow them, they'll seep in. Sir?
Yeah, I would say from the newspapermen, journalists, magazines, that would put those red maps out as though it were some monolithic, Kremlin-centered organization. But I think people like Canada, there's other people in government understood that you mentioned Yugoslavia, there were already cracks.
Sure.
It was not, if we learn to play with those cracks and exploit them.
No, and I think you're exactly right. In fact, I think one of the problems here is that these actions are being interpreted through kind of an Adolf Hitler Nazi filter, that we've seen one monolithic dictator take over Europe, and now we're seeing another. The problem is there are no shades of red during this early part of the Cold War. Any deviation left, any slight deviation left, you're suspect of being a red. You don't have, kind of a really light rose to flaming red, commie red on this end. That's going to come out, I would argue that's going to come out a little later, and we're not going to recognize that full bore till really after the Cold War. But you're exactly right. There are significant differences between Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Estonia, China even. We're going to see the Sino-Soviet split much later as well. So, but the problem is the context of the period, these guys don't see it. All roads lead back to the Soviet Union. We do think it's one big monolithic threat. And the problem is the policymakers, the guys planning war plans, they all believe it too. Sir?
You said that in 49 we became aware, we reported back that there was radiation. Were we already doing overflights in border probes?
Yes.
Out of where?
All over Europe and in Asia as well. Pakistan. In fact, there's a really good book called The Need to Know, which is all about the early overflights of, and it's not necessarily overflights, what we're doing is really probing boundaries to test air defense and then get intelligence if we can on the Soviet Union. And it's published by Air University Press. Air University Press. The final year here, which is all going to come to a head essentially. We have NSC 68 submitted to Truman. And that guy with the bow tie, who I kind of have an affinity for, by the way, because the bow tie. It's just a good look. Is Paul Nitze. And he comes from a Wall Street family. He's a lawyer by training. He's worked with the Air Force on the Strategic Bombing Survey. And he's going to actually assume the policy planning staff position after George F. Kennan. What happens is that Kennan is going to get on the bad side of Dean Acheson, who's going to emerge in 49 as the new Secretary of State after Marshall retires. And Atchison doesn't get along very well with Kennan, so Kennan's going to get shipped out to Czechoslovakia as an ambassador, and Nitz is going to come in and essentially assume the reins of the policy planning staff. And what happens is that Nitz is going to take what Kennan's been working on, the containment policy, and draft it into what becomes NSC 68, which is this 65, 68-page document that lays out 3 or 4 courses of action on what we need to do in the Cold War. But the significant ones are, number 1, the Soviet Union is our primary enemy. Number 2, we have to rebuild the military. And number 3, in the interim, while we rebuild the military, we're going to have to rely on nuclear weapons, which are the 3 major elements of NSC 68. Now, based upon those 3 points, what NSC 68 is going to argue is that we need to embrace a policy of containment, which is the same thing Kennan argued. But the problem is that Nitz is going to go one step further and say that the Soviet Union only respects one thing, and that's force and the use of force. So what we really need to do is play zone defense, but what we really need is a strong, strong military. And we need to demonstrate to the Soviet Union that we mean business and we have the force to back it up, which is a significant change from what Kennan's arguing. Kennan's arguing a much more blended element of containment with the diplomatic, economic, and political sides in military, and they kind of float and move as you need them. Nitz is going to say, no, military is the way. It's a big capital M, and that's what they respect, and that's out in front of everything. The other elements are used to kind of backfill and probe where the military can't. Okay? And Kennan and Nitz are often depicted as bitter rivalries, which they are. And in fact, Nitz's grandson just wrote a book called The Hawk and the Dove, which talks about how actually these guys have a pretty decent relationship and they respect one another. I'd highly recommend that too. So what happens is that Nitz is going to draft this document. It's going to go up to the new National Security Council. They're going to sign off on it, and that's what NSC 68 is, National Security Council. 68 is just the number of the document that happened to pass the desk that day, so they just sign in a number. He's going to give it to Truman in April 1950. And Truman's going to read the document, and he's going to agree with the Soviet Union as our primary threat. He's kind of okay with relying on atomic weapons, but he's not okay with investing in the military, rearming, because it costs lots of money. And this is going to wreck the economic rebound that we're getting after the war. So it's going to sit on his desk until the North Koreans attack the South Koreans, which Janet will handle all that copious detail next month in a great way. But what happens is that this attack, which is going to be supported by both the Chinese and then at least get the okay from Stalin as well, is that it's going to demonstrate to Truman that something really does need to be done. We are going to have to reinvest, because what happens is that as the North Koreans pour across the South Korean border, it's going to be essentially a rout in the first few weeks. So we're going to have to pull forces from Europe to help bolster forces in Korea. So we're already at a significant disadvantage in Europe, and now you're going to pull even more forces from there to go help support in Korea. So if you're Truman, does that make you feel more secure or less secure in Western Europe? Less secure, significantly less secure, okay? So what's the poor president to do? Well, you have this document on your desk that says, let's reinvest in the military, rebuild the military, identify the Soviet Union as our primary threat, and put our reliance as we build up the military on atomic weapons to maintain our nuclear superiority. So by September 20th, 1950, NSC 68 is signed. The United States has now embraced the Cold War with a containment policy. We're going to rely on nuclear weapons to offset the Soviet conventional advantage. We're going to rebuild our military. NATO has been established, the UN has been established, and we're in a hot war in Korea. And mind you, this is 5 years after the end of the war. Questions? Sir?
Can you help me out? I'm taking a class right now on everything after the Cold War. But they're basically in a class that said that Stalin had nothing to do with the decision of North Korea to attack South Korea. Can you help out?
Sure. You can't cite me, though, as a source. Actually, the North Koreans go to Stalin and say, hey, we want to do this.
That's what I thought.
And Stalin says, I don't know. It looks kind of risky. What does Mao say about it? Go ask Mao. And there's some wink, wink, nod, nod. Maybe we'll give you some money. So the short answer is the Soviets technically reject it, and they go get assistance through the Chinese, but the Soviet Union is going to come back and give them arms and trainers to help support the force too. Okay? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And no, they're trainers. They're just training. They just have them flying combat missions. That's all. And there's been some really good work over the last 2 years, getting access to both North Korean archives and Soviet archives to prove the fact that the Soviets are much more involved, at least on the air side and with the training or the advisor side on ground forces in both artillery, tanks, and armor, or infantry, sorry, than we ever suspected. So, but the official word is no, we don't want to help you, but they do flow weapons through later. Other questions? Sir?
Was NISA connected to the Cargill group? Cargill?
I don't think so. No, he works for, I'm trying to think who he works for.
From Wall Street, right?
Yeah, but it's one of those big banks that just failed, like Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns. He works for one of those. And there's a whole, the Dulles brothers come from that same pedigree as well. So there's a whole group of Cold War warriors that emerge out of Wall Street, lawyers, financial types that are big policy players through the 50s and up to the 60s. But I'm not sure if he was connected to that. I know that he owned Vail at one point. He bought it early on and then sold it to Purina later.
That's a nice segue to my question.
Okay.
It's more philosophical, but from a Soviet perspective, in World War I, was capitalism out of control. World War II made capitalism out of control. And now the Cold War, and some would say that us re-engaging so vigorously, militarizing basically American foreign policy, we were prolonging that, putting Americans back to work to do that. And I just wonder, is there any truth to that? When I talk to Russians, they will say, you may have won the Cold War, but the battle has yet to be, the final battle has yet to be worked out yet, because the lessons that we learned, I don't know. It's a philosophical question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the way historians look at the Cold War, there's essentially three schools. You have the first realist school that says, oh no, it's all the Soviet Union's fault because they're encroaching upon free and democratic nations. The second school, which is, and those are folks that, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., those guys that kind of lived during the Second World War, saw that happen, and are looking at this through the prism of World War II. The second school thought it's going to emerge in the late 50s and 60s and start arguing, well, maybe the United States is at fault here, because what we're really looking for is access to economic markets. So what we're doing is essentially trying to flood Western Europe with U.S. dollars and open up markets, and that's going to upset the Soviet Union. And that's the revisionist school, William Appleman Williams, Walter Lippmann. And I think there's something to that. It's not one or the other. And the third school was, well, we're both at fault. And that seems to make more sense, that from a perspective of today, we can look at that. But if you're living in the moment, I mean, you don't want to trust communism, number one, because ideologically, it's the complete antithesis of what we believe. And they don't want to trust democracy and capitalism because, by Marxist ideology, we are the cause of every problem in the world, and we will essentially be overtaken by the proletariat. So that ideological rift can't be necessarily patched over. It's always going to be a problem. And I think the only way to solve it is one of them has to go away. One and then two.
I'm just going to say, I don't know if anybody else is finding this or not, but I just find myself kind of like deja vu or whatever. And I look at some of these pictures that you've included and talking about it and remembering going to the movies and seeing, the newsreels. And that's the way we got pictures of this sort of thing, unlike today. And it's just,
Well, yeah, and that's, I think, as we go through the program, we're going to get more of that duck and cover and more of the nuclear hysteria. I think, John, you're doing some of that, aren't you? Yeah, right. We don't want to create any PTSD flashbacks, though. We're trying not to do that. Sir?
What point did mutually assured destruction, the seeds of mutually assured destruction get planted?
1964.
Okay.
Stay tuned for that.
We'll do a couple more sentences.
Yes. I'm not sure who's doing that one. Actually, I may be in doing. I'm coming back to do détente and arms control, so I may handle some of that. Yeah, Mad's a little later than that, though. Yeah. Okay. Sir.
In 1949 or 1950,
There is some speculation, and this is kind of a myth that's emerged, that Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, makes a speech in '49 saying, the U.S. has vowed to protect these nations, and one of the nations he leaves off is South Korea. And the North Koreans, see, they don't care about South Korea. That's not true. It was legitimate. He just forgot to put South Korea on the list. You're the Cold War expert, but. So yeah, I mean, no, it was just somebody left off. Whoever the speechwriter was must have been running at the last minute and just left off South Korea. Oops. Yeah. But it makes a good story, though.
What is the Department of Defense going to be?
That's a trick question. 47 under National Security Act, but then there's revisions up through 51 and 52. So it's a moving target, yeah. And what they're doing is really codifying force structures, Joint Chiefs of Staff structures, how it interacts with the executive agency, things like that.
Like our current Department of Homeland Security?
Yeah, it actually goes much smoother though, and it's not as big, by the way. Yeah, but it is a good analogy. Any other questions or comments? Why, thank you.